Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapters 1150 and 1151 mark the beginning of a new era for One Piece with the descent of demons and our first look at Imu's mysterious abilities, while Chapter 1152 kicks off the long-awaited Elbaf flashback. There is a ton to talk about, so let's get right into it. Of course, we have to first talk about our 34th and 35th entries in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story, as we find Yamato having made it all the way to the Enma Shrine in Hakumai. Tagging along is of course Yamato's new followers, Page 1 and Ulti, the latter of which is carrying the Amigasa made by Tama that was to be gifted to Kawamatsu. While this brings the pilgrimage to an end, it does not close out the cover story, as there are still a few more steps on Yamato's journey. After leaving Hakumai, Yamato needs to go through Ringo and then return back to the Flower Capital, so there still should be plenty more chapters left. In 1151, we find Yamato participating in a sumo competition in Hakumai as they toss out Sukune, the older brother of Urushima, who we last saw toward the start of the cover story waving goodbye to Yamato in the Flower Capital. In the background is Kawamatsu, who we formally learn is the daimyo of Hakumai in the following chapter. There, we see them gifted the new hat, which follows Oda's cartoon logic of growing in size to meet the needs of the user, as it was much smaller when Yamato and Ulti were seen carrying it. But enough about that, let's get into these chapters. With Imu just having entered the scene by way of possessing Gunko's body, they start things off with a ridiculous discharge of Conquerors haki. Given how this burst extends all the way across the Sun World, reaching the Western Village, and even down into the Underworld, as we find out in 1151, Imu is a serious contender to have some of the most potent Conquerors haki in the series. The last time we saw something like this was at the end of the Egghead arc when Emmett released Joy Boy's haki, knocking out all of the Straw Hat's enemies on and around the coast of the island. The Giants compared the power on display in that scene to the haki of Shanks, who has also been shown reaching incredible lengths with their Conquerors haki, reaching from the waters outside Wano to just outside the Flower Capital. Now one could say that Shanks and Joy Boy had more precision with their haki in these scenes, as Shanks was able to direct it at specifically Admiral Ryukyu, and Joy Boy was somehow able to discern those who pose a threat to our heroes and their allies, while here, Imu just releases their haki unabashedly, and it doesn't even knock out everyone in its presence. Despite this, I do think it's rather likely that the haki we saw here was greater in volume or quantity than what we saw in Egghead, just given how large the island of Elbaf is. This is also not the first time we've someone make use of haki while inside another person's physical body. Back during the Punk Hazard arc, when the Straw Hats were subjected to having their personalities swapped, we saw Sanji was capable of using observation haki despite being in Nami's body. This all makes sense with the idea that haki is a manifestation of the person's will or spirit, rather than something governed by their physicality. Now, speaking of bodies, Gunko's is looking a little bit different now that Imu has taken over. We saw in 1150 that her hair had suddenly grown out, and at the time, I was not necessarily sure if this was just the rest of her hair dropping down after being inside her hat, but now that we see Gunko with other new body parts, this does seem like a byproduct of Imu's possession. It's a very mundane detail to include amongst the other demonic transformations, but I have to wonder if this could be seen as a suggestion of Imu's real appearance. We have gotten slight hints from prior depictions of Imu's silhouette that could indicate they have similar long hair. Imu's possession also spawned these large wings and a pointed tail, really playing into this long-held idea that Imu is some sort of devil or sea devil, Satan figure, and this devilish tail also recontextualizes the scene of Sabo and Cobra being stabbed by a similar shape. Many had speculated that this may have been the product of Imu drawing upon Gunko's arrow abilities, perhaps even an ability bestowed to her by Imu in the first place, since Gunko has been shown using arrows in a similar offensive manner. But now that we see Imu can actually spawn a devil's tail, then things may swing back in the other direction in favor of this just being one of Imu's attacks. Imu shows off several occult abilities in this chapter, several of which go unnamed. The first one involves using the trident, another classic piece of devil's imagery, to spawn the Abyss magic circle, from which two cannons or gun barrels poke out and launch explosive projectiles at the giant warriors. While we saw earlier in the arc that the Abyss could be used to transport chests, clothes, and chairs, along with a marked individual, this is the first time that we've seen the Abyss be used to summon solely an inanimate object. And I guess more specifically, this is also the first time we've seen the Abyss used to spawn part of an object to be used, since it's not like the entire cannon or gun was pulled out of the circle. We also see them conjure a tome with a design on the cover resembling the pentagram that we've seen with the Abyss circle. Hilariously, Imu summons a book in order to summon weapons from the book itself, a large double-barrel flintlock pistol, effectively the size of a bazooka, and a dagger. The design on this firearm actually reminds me a bit of the gun wielded by Gin when he was holding Zeph as hostage. Now, the dagger is used to stab Brogy's hand and free Imu from his grasp, while the gun is strong enough to blow the hand clean off. This whole bit reminded me a lot of Little Garden, where Broggy was similarly impaled through the same hand with a large dagger made from Mr. Three's wax powers, and later in that arc, Zoro suggested they cut off their limbs to put up a fight, and as we see in this chapter, Broggy is able to fight with his hand disconnected thanks to Imu's powers. Which brings us to the most prominent power that we see on display, Domi Reversi. By spawning an abyss circle beneath Broggy, they are able to pull him down and transform his state of being by flipping him through the circle itself. This turns him into a demonic version equipped with ghastly eyes, demonic wings and horns, as well as altered versions of their weapons that all resemble the classic Devil's Trident in some way, with Broggy's Bruiser Axe becoming more of a halberd, and Dory's Terry Sword turning into a trident with elongated center blade. These transformations are also evocative of their epithets, the Red Ogre and the Blue Ogre, as they are now more closely resembling their demonic creatures of the Japanese legend that their epithets are referencing. This is also pretty interesting when you recall one of Usopp's lies or boasts from early on in the series, where in the English translation by Viz, he refers to himself as the Demon King Usopp. While this exact phrasing is not present in the original, the notion of Usopp being a demon or devil is, so I wonder if we'll get to see this lie come true like many others throughout the series. According to Imu, this transformation requires some amount of the target's lifespan to be taken as part of the Diabolical Covenant, and in return, they receive an immortal body and great strength that, according to Imu, allows them to be unbound by common sense and logic. This may help to explain why Broggy is able to use his severed hand as if it were still attached, and actually, it brings into question if the immortality granted to these demons is the same immortality granted to the Elders and the Holy Knights. At the very least, it doesn't seem like the Elders and the Knights underwent the same ritual as the Giants, given their distinct lack of demonic features that we see in this chapter. And the fact that Broggy's arm does not simply regenerate and reconnect is interesting, as we've speculated for a while that the immortality possessed by the Elders is not necessarily retroactive, meaning it would not restore any damage to their bodies that they had previously had, explaining the scars they possess. Now, perhaps the most interesting part of this power is its ability to propagate onto others. Anyone who is physically between two demons has the Domi Reversi transformation applied to them as well. This is a nod to the board game from which this move is named after, Reversi, perhaps better known by the iteration Othello. This is a game in which two players try to dominate the board by converting enemy pieces into their own color, which is done when a piece finds itself between two enemy pieces. This reference is made a little more explicit in 1151 when Thorman finds himself between his captains. You may recall initially seeing him during the Egghead arc. Your reference to this board game is rather interesting when you consider it the latest entry in the world government's recurring motif of being associated with games. Back during the Wano arc, we saw Cypher Pole Zero agents represent the ongoing conflict with Go pieces, with even Guernica's design being a nod to this, with the game pieces being his eyes. And there's also the native hunting competitions that the Celestial Dragons partake in, which are effectively island-wide games of manhunts. And even more recently, just before Shamrock left for the Holy Land, he told the other knights they could make a game out of their mission, using the English loanword Gameu. Summers had later complained that the game was playing out too easily for them just before the Straw Hats got involved, and there's even an argument to be made that the world government flag, which is understood to be representing the 4 Seas in the Grand Line, may actually be another reference to one of these games with the 4 pieces surrounding one. On one hand, this recurring focus on games could just be an extension of the Celestial Dragon's natural sadistic tendencies, but it's also rather heavy-handed that these games like Reversi and Go are just being referred to, given how explicitly they paint the picture as being black and white, or good or evil. We've long understood this ongoing struggle between the people of the world and the government to have this sort of dynamic, though I am interested to see some of the more nuance in between with the gray areas. I'm also excited to see if there will be other board games use as references to feel this motif. Oda is a big fan of giving his villain groups a specific theme. Pre-time skip included things such as Baroqueworks having holiday-based naming schemes, or Enel's priests being named after Buddhist references, while in the post-time skip, we had a card game motif going on with the Flamingo's family, having the 4 card suits, and Kaido's crew being named after various card games as well. Now, while Imu's abilities may seem like an entirely new power system at a glance, it should be noted that nothing we've seen them do here is something that we haven't seen in the series before from a Devil Fruit. This ability to store and withdraw things from books is similar to what we've seen from the Book Fruit and the Scroll Fruit. The ability to take someone's lifespan is also shared by Big Mom's Soul Fruit, and the notion of changing someone's appearance and behavior by forcing a contract upon them is very similar to Sugar's Hobby Fruit. Funny enough, that fruit also had a byproduct of stopping the user from aging physically, which could end up coming into play with Imu and the Elders. Now, this idea of affecting people's behavior with the quote-unquote magic circles is also a bit reminiscent of the hypnotic abilities of Miss Golden Week's color traps, and I bring this up just to remind us that hypnotism has always been a basic reality in this world. And if we extend the scope to beyond what we have just seen in these few chapters, then we can also liken what we assume is Imu's ability to grant immortality and or specific abilities to what we saw from Gecko Moria's Shadow Fruit. All this is to say that I still believe that we are probably dealing with some sort of devil fruit ability, or perhaps a combination of them, here with Imu. Back in chapter 1144, Oda had Jinbei go out of his way to remind the characters, and perhaps even us as readers, that even the strangest powers in this world can be traced back to a devil fruit. This sort of line reads as extremely obvious, given that we are on our way toward 1200 chapters of the series, unless it was meant to inform our expectations just before heading into the reveal of Imu's potential. Now, it's clear the government's public-facing image is laden with hypocrisy, with the various holy references and titles that they use for themselves, despite their outwardly cruel behavior, so perhaps the existence of Imu as a devilish or demonic being is another instance of that, where the powers of the ancient kingdom that fought against Imu and the government were stigmatized and associated with devils, hence the devil fruit. Imu's plans for these demonic giants is to have them take Jarl's head and declare Dori and Brogi as the rulers of Elbaf, allowing Imu to take control of the island by proxy. This is somewhat sensible, but feels a bit too formal or contrived for someone trying to simply conquer the nation. With this sort of power, Imu could probably just declare themselves as the ruler and make the giants submit using hostages like the original plan was to be, but the idea of instilling intermediary rulers, ones that the other giants once looked up to and have now been disgraced and deformed, really shows that this is more than just military dominance. It's also a bit personal, as the Holy Knights have expressed their goal is to upend what makes Elbaf who they are as a people. The idea of Harald making a mistake or failing is brought up once again, this time by Imu, and with the reveal of their ability to control others and force them into being antagonistic, we really have to consider just exactly what went down between Harald, Loki, and Jarl on that fateful day of Harald's death 14 years prior. As it stands, our current understanding is supposed to be that Loki killed him in order to take the legendary fruit of Elbaf, and we've long assumed there to be more to the story, perhaps involving Loki being mischaracterized in order to preserve Harald's public image, or even something like Jarl being the one to kill Harald, blaming Loki for the act. But now we have to entertain the idea of Harald being corrupted by Imu's ability and being forced to act against the nation's interests. The way it's phrased, Harald having failed, suggests that there was some amount of intention or agency involved in whatever it was that he did to disrupt the government's plans. So perhaps he was working with the government for a period of time with the hopes of establishing a beneficial relationship, but later realized he was being manipulated and pulled back, which may have forced Imu's hand into acting and corrupting the king. This would have led to the all-out fight between Harald, Jarl, Loki, and the rest of the Elbaf warriors that died in that castle, resulting in Jarl and Loki overpowering Harald. And with Elbaf's belief in a noble death, perhaps they decided to obscure the circumstances of Harald's manipulation and demise, and instead pinned the blame on Loki, whom the nation already seemingly disliked for his behavior. After all, when Imu's haki spread across the Sun World, we do see Jarl reacting to it, looking the most serious he's been since he's been reintroduced in the story, almost as if he's recognized it from before. In that panel, you can also make out an elderly giant woman who has her hair up just like Ronya. Perhaps this is her grandmother and the mother of Ronya's father, who we met several chapters ago. There's still a lot of mystery surrounding Jarl, especially from that chapter titled An Older Woman, in which he expressed that his type was someone older. There were some thoughts that perhaps he was just referring to someone like Mother Carmel, but there's also just the inherent possibility of him referring to someone from an older time. Being around 4 centuries old, he surely must know of some secrets from the world's history, perhaps even in relation to Imu. I'm also looking forward to any potential action we'll see between Dori, Brogi, and Jarl. While the other villagers are looking to take shelter and hide, Jarl is still a true warrior and is looking to meet the challenge head on. Could we perhaps even see a team up between Usopp and Jarl against the giant warrior pirate captains? The other really interesting part of this chapter is Killingham's face reveal with his supposed man-beast form. In it, he allows a centaur-like transformation with his human body from the waist up and his Kirin features below, not unlike what we saw with Nusura's hybrid transformation in the previous arc, or even Black Maria back on Wano, albeit her transformation was modified through the use of external supplements. Now, if this form is what is being formally labeled as his man-beast form, that begs the question what his initial appearance was supposed to be. There, he had the inverse, where he was a Kirin from the waist up with the lower body of a man, albeit also with arms and hands like a regular human as well. It could just be the case that Killingham is just very adept at controlling his transformations and can apply partial transformations at will, as we've seen in the series with characters like Marco. In any case, it seems he's able to generate flame clouds to run on top of, allowing him to traverse the skies, much like how we saw with Kaido and Momonosuke. We also learn in these chapters that the nightmares have been spawning from specific locations across the island from what are called nightmare holes. This seems to be an ongoing ability, as the sleepwalking kids can be influenced to dream of new nightmares, which results in these cartoonish devil monsters appearing as well. I know there's been some speculation that Killingham may be a fisherman, given his facial features, but it should be noted that sharp spiked teeth are not completely unusual for humans, as we've seen with characters like Katakuri. Now, chapter 1151 also features the return of Shaggy, whose transponder snail has now made its way to being on top of Loki's chest. It's not clear if this was moved there for him by someone else off screen, or if it just made its way there. Since last we saw, it was positioned on a rock near where Loki was supposed to be imprisoned. Which reminds me, Loki's human followers should still be hiding somewhere in the underworld. I'm wondering when they'll come back and play. Anyways, we learn that Shaggy seems to have something curious going on and can no longer speak with Loki for a while, prompting Loki to wonder if they're in danger once again. Now, I can't recall if I've spoken on this theory in the channel before, but I've been fond for a while of this idea that Shaggy may be Shirahoshi. The idea feels far-fetched at first glance, but there are some interesting components that piece things together. The first point that may be a little lost in translation is how Shaggy speaks. It's extremely polite. This particular over-the-top respectful cadence is one used by Shirahoshi, and while there are some slight differences in the honorifics they use to refer to someone, this could be thought of as Oda's attempt to obscure the true identity, since it may be too evident if Shirahoshi's exact verbal quirks were present. The next connection is a bit more meta-contextual, in that it would be a connection for us as the reader, as opposed to the characters within the story. Now, Loki refers to the speaker as Shaggy, and it's not yet clear if that's supposed to be a nickname for the person on the other end, or just what Loki calls them because of the transponder snail's appearance. As a reminder, transponder snails do not always take the form of the person using them or speaking through them, and this snail in particular was introduced as a new kind that is equipped for cold climates, which may be why he has such a woolly appearance. Back during Odin's flashback, Roger joked that Neptune's future daughter would be as hairy or as shaggy as he was. In that same flashback, we would also get this line from the Sea Kings talking about the arrival of their mermaid princess and how the two sovereigns would meet eventually. At the time, we all sort of just assumed this to be in reference to Luffy and Shirahoshi, but there may be some reason to believe that this was actually in reference to Prince Loki, who would be an actual sovereign figure as opposed to Luffy, who was just a metaphorical one with the king of the pirates. Also on that idea, in the Japanese, Shaggy is referred to Mosako, with Mosa being potentially coming from the phrase Mosa Mosa, which is used to describe someone who is hairy, and Ko being a suffix that can be used to denote friendly respect, but it can also mean some sort of duke or royal, which is why many originally thought Shaggy to be an imported royal figure. Upon their introduction, Shaggy was relaying a terrible event that happened to them to Loki, to which the giant suggested killing them all in revenge. This tragic event could have been Shirahoshi's recent attempted abduction by St. Charlos. This may even be why Loki was so antagonistic to the special dragons that tried to recruit him off rip. Sort of in this vein, Shaggy could be telling Loki that they are unable to communicate from now on because of some sort of other terrible situation falling upon them, perhaps even something like Blackbeard coming to abduct her, given her status as Poseidon, as informed by Caribou. There are, of course, some big logical leaps, such as the idea that Shirahoshi and Loki would have had to have been speaking for a while, despite her being confined to her tower for most of her life. But these contrivances are not too different from what needs to be hand-waved to allow Loki and anyone else to end up communicating anyways, as Loki somehow getting the specific transponder snail that works off voice recognition is pretty far-fetched to begin with, especially considering that Elbaf uses transponder pillbugs and not snails. Now, in this chapter, it feels rather intentional that this Shaggy person calls Loki while all of the Straw Hats are occupied with rescuing Chopper. This may suggest to me that Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji may have recognized Shaggy's voice if they were present, which is another point toward the idea that this may be Shirahoshi, or at the very least, someone that we've encountered in the story before. Speaking of, Luffy also strangely mentions that he sensed Chopper falling from the Sun World. It seems someone else, perhaps either Sanji or Zoro, heard something in the distance, but Luffy was able to recognize it specifically as Chopper. This may be a subtle hint that Luffy's observation hockey is improving, coupled with what we got at the start of the arc, with Luffy sensing Loki while Sanji and Zoro were unable to. But anyways, this brings us to chapter 1152, so let's get into it. Gaban suggests that the key to defeating the Holy Knight's regeneration lies in the usage of Conquerors hockey, as we first saw with him severing Rick Summers' arm and upper torso. However, it seems this is only a temporary solution, as we would later see that Summers being able to reattach himself and regenerate his limb. This may also suggest that Luffy was not actively using any sort of Conquerors hockey when he was fighting the Elders in the previous arc, which I suppose was intentional by Oda to allow them to be more threatening. Interestingly, this comment prompts Loki to come to a realization about his own abilities as well. It's not clear if this is supposed to suggest that Loki is able to use Conquerors too, though it wouldn't be too big of a surprise if he could. What's more curious though, is that he mentions having experienced the Holy Knight's powers for himself. This is in fact true, as Shamrock and Gunko put him in his current condition earlier in the arc, but the immortality was not on display at the time. So could Loki actually be referring to another instance in which he encountered the Holy Knights, perhaps one that we see in this chapter in just a bit? Gaban also notes that there's more than one Conqueror's user among the Straw Hats, which invites this hilarious gag where Sanji believes that it's him. Gaban is more explicitly referring to Zoro, who is shocked to learn that he has it, and this comes after both Kaido and King mentioned that Zoro was using Conquerors, but in both instances, Zoro just shrugs it off as if he didn't understand what was being said to him. It makes some sense that Zoro did not realize what he was doing, as swordsmen are already so adept at infusing their blades with their haki, so he likely just thought he was applying his armament haki as usual. Couple that with his use of Enma, a blade that pulls the user's haki out of them extraneously, and it follows that Zoro's innate Conquerors was put on display. In hindsight, there are some things we can look back at as foreshadowing for Zoro's Conquerors reveal, with the most prominent example in my mind being his fight against Monet. Back then, Zoro slices Monet in two, but apparently does not apply armament haki when doing so, which leaves her in a severed state. Shiggy figures this to be Monet being paralyzed by the threat of Zoro's attack had he applied haki, which all things considered is a lot like what Conqueror's haki is in the first place, overpowering an enemy with your own will. But to take this a step further, Monet is temporarily unable to put herself back together despite her Logia body, which is exactly what we saw in these last few chapters, with Gaban applying Conquerors to prevent Summers from reforming his body as well. Now, as for Sanji, I do believe it's completely plausible for him to end up unlocking his Conquerors. The sequence of him asking Gaban is very interesting and reads as if their conversation is being overshadowed by Loki and Hiruden's exchange, allowing for the possibility of Gaban telling him that he does indeed have it. Speaking of, Hiruden still does not trust Loki, rightfully so, and despite this, both Gaban and Luffy believe in Loki's intentions, with the latter even asking him to join his crew in order to take responsibility for Loki. While that does not pan out, Gaban cites his memory of a strange burst of haki similar to the one that we saw here on the day that Harald died. This leads us into what may be one of the greatest flashbacks in the series. It all kicks off 14 years prior on the day that Harald died, with Jarl and Loki being summoned to the castle. Jarl arrives via Svar as we saw in the present day, but interestingly, Loki jumps down onto the scene. His portrayal here reminded me a bit of how we saw Joy Boy in that scene from Vegapunk's message, and I wonder from where it is that he jumped. It's possible that he was just leaping across Elbaf to get here, perhaps from a higher branch, but it would be really interesting if he was actually spending time up on the Astroworld, a place that we've yet to see in the story proper. Loki also has a different hammer at this point in time, one that more closely resembles a mallet with these unique runes or inscriptions around it. This is distinct from the more Mjolnir-esque square hammer that we saw in the present day that we've learned is called Ragnir. I've speculated on the channel before that Ragnir may have a larger weight or case around it, just given its shape and the small extended part at the bottom, so perhaps this is Ragnir's original appearance. It's also cool to see the interior of Aros Castle as it was before it was destroyed, relative to what we saw earlier in the arc when the Straw Hats first entered. I'll make note of this now. When we first saw the aftermath of the struggle, we saw that there were skeletons and tons of swords sticking out, but in this flashback, all of the guards seem to use pole arms or glaives. Not sure what to make of it, but perhaps these swords belong to an external force that we have yet to see. Of course, Jarl and Loki walk into a horrifying scene of Harald being attacked by all of his men. It's curious that Harald is portrayed in silhouette here, even though we know what he looked like before he died, thanks to the portrait in the castle. After these last few chapters, I'm inclined to think that Harald is being possessed or transformed by Emu, just as we saw with Dory and Brogy in present day. Some might mistake his appearance as already being demonified, but note that these are just his spiked shoulder ornaments and his mustache protruding from his face, not wings or horns. Harald was said to have failed or made a mistake, so perhaps what we're seeing here is Emu's punishment for that. Harald could have allied with the world government, but eventually changed his mind, which would have prompted Emu to take matters into their own hands, but corrupting the king, quite literally. We get the aftermath of the scene, with Jarl being pierced through the head with a blade, one that we've been saying for a while on the channel that belonged to Harald, and this seems to be the case given the sword we see on his hip on the final page. This scene of someone coming upon Elbaf's forbidden devil fruit is curious as well, as it's hard to tell who it is from the silhouette. We were told that Loki was the one who killed his father to get the fruit, but as anticipated, it seems there's more to the story. This is also a bit of confirmation that Harald had not eaten the fruit, but rather it was just passed down from generation to generation. Now, when this concept was first introduced, many speculated that this fruit may have actually been the Gum Gum fruit or the Nika fruit, and now that it seems plausible that it was not actually consumed by Harald, this could be the case. Perhaps the world government's true motives was to take the fruit back for themselves, all the while gaining control of Elbaf, and Loki did not actually consume the fruit, rather the fruit was stolen. Loki would have then been blamed for all the destruction to the castle, the death of the guards, the injury to Jarl, as well as the disappearance of the fruit, all in an attempt to cover up what happened on that fateful day. I've speculated on the channel before that Loki may not actually have a devil fruit himself, and instead, it's his hammer, Ragnir, that holds the ability. Loki seems to be quite active and mobile, despite being covered in the most sea stone that we've ever seen in the series. Sea stone that was potent enough for Luffy to almost lose consciousness after briefly touching it. Now, we've seen characters maintain their strength despite wearing sea stone before, but it's never been to this large of scale. Could it be that Loki does not necessarily feel weakened because he's a devil fruit user himself, and instead, these are just unbreakable chains that don't sap his strength? Whatever the case is, we do know that there was likely a third party involved, given that someone allegedly obstructed the doorway to prevent anyone from escaping. We see a great burst of hockey in the scene as well, similar to what we saw when Emu possessed Gunko, and this reaches all the way down to where Shanks and Kaban were. On this day, it seems Shanks had come to visit Kaban, who had lost track of time since Roger's death. It's been 10 years since Roger was executed at this point, but to Kaban it has felt like 3 or 4. This of course further continues the ideas that some fans have that there's some sort of time dilation going on in Elbaf, where time passes slower here than it does on the outside world. People like to point to Louis Arnaud's message toward the start of the arc, as well as other instances of characters losing track of time, like Shanks during the Egghead arc, or even Emu growing impatient with how long the Holy Knights were taking. While I think this may be plausible, we also have concrete indications of time passing normally, such as Oimo and Kashi's acknowledgement that it's been 40 years since their captors have been fighting, back during the Big Mom flashback. The more interesting part of the scene, however, is the tattoo on Shanks' left arm. This mark is extremely reminiscent of the designs that we've seen on both Killingham and Summer's armbands, with the circles surrounding a cross with embellished ends. There are some differences, such as Killingham's design featuring an additional component at the top, but the basic pattern is the same. Whatever it is, this suggests that Shanks has been affiliated with the Holy Knights sometime between Roger's death and 14 years ago. We had learned he had returned to the Holy Land for a little while but left, as explained by Shamrock earlier in this arc, but to think that he also joined the ranks of the Knights is very interesting. Now, I initially took this to just be some sort of Holy Knight symbol, like a Jolly Roger or logo, but given that it varies from person to person, I wonder if this is an indicator of rank or title. In any case, this could also be the mark that was referred to earlier in the arc, when the Holy Knights were considering how to get the abducted children back to Mary Joie. The mark was required to send them through this abyss circle, and it begs the question why Shanks would have this tattooed on his arm when Killingham and Shamrock just wear it as a band. It's to be seen if the mark is also what allows the wearer with the immortality or regeneration abilities that we've seen on display. This is particularly concerning, given that this is the arm that Shanks lost to the Lord of the Coast when he went to save Luffy in Chapter 1. Losing the arm with this important symbol seems very convenient, but it makes me wonder if Shanks had been nigh immortal up until then, though of course this would mean his clash with Blackbeard was before he returned to the Holy Land and received the status, since he did not have a scar during Roger's execution, or it would mean that he did not have regenerative powers when he left Mary Joie, which I think is more likely the case. It should also be noted that this mark was definitely given to him after Roger's execution when he returned to the Holy Land, as he's not seen with it during his childhood on the crew. Actually, given that Shanks returned to Mary Joie after the crew disbanded, I think the idea that Roger told Shanks he was a celestial dragon is more likely now than ever, so after Roger's death 24 years ago, Shanks would go to Mary Joie for at most 2 years before leaving to become a pirate, as he tried to recruit Yasopp to his crew 22 years ago. Things also get a bit more interesting though, since Shanks mentions that he met Harald in Mary Joie, which would have happened between 24 and 22 years ago as just stated, and that would line up with what we know about Harald's movement to pacify Elbaf being around for at least 20 years. While this is the first mention of Harald being at Mary Joie, we did get hints of it earlier in the arc when we were told about the pranks Loki would pull while Harald was away on his trips. There's also a certain subject that Shanks wishes to discuss with Harald that could not be done when they met. Could this be in reference to the legendary devil fruit of Elbaf? If that was the Gum Gum fruit that was taken by the government, then it would line up that Shanks and his crew took it back during the following year, 13 years ago. There's a lot of mystery here with Shanks and his involvement, and I can't wait to see where it goes. The end of this chapter takes us to a flashback within a flashback as we turn to 109 years in the past, back when the giant warrior pirates were ravaging the seas. However, they were not alone, as it seems the royal ship led by King Harald was also partaking in this campaign of terror. With this, we get the reveal of Harald as a younger man, with his horns intact, as we learn that he was a bit of a low-life scumbag, as the narrator explains. It's going to be incredibly fun to see how this merciless god becomes the pacifist deity the Elbaf Giants have come to know, and potentially all the characters that may have come along the way. Kureha and Mother Carmel were both alive at this time, and who knows, maybe this even blends into the Brook flashback since he was born 90 years ago, allowing us to revisit his relationship with Gunko. One quick detail here is that the narrator mentions Harald was 45 at this time, or 15 in human years. This means he was around 140 years old when he died, but more curiously, this is a bit of a departure from the established maturation rate of the giants. Back in Volume 19's SBS, Oda mentioned how giants mature about half as slow as humans while living 3 times as longer. This could simply be an oversight, or perhaps the maturation rate is not as linear when it comes to giants in their younger years, or maybe it's even different for those who have ancient giant blood. Who knows? In any case, I can't wait to see what's in store with this flashback. Let me know down in the comments what you're hoping to see, and as always, you can find all of my weekly manga breakdowns in the playlist in the description. And if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.